Attention everyone, this is your half-hour call to places. This is Half Hour. You're listening to Dynamic Dialogues. Whether you're a long-standing professional in the field, an aspiring stage manager, or simply curious about what happens behind the curtain, you're invited to be a part of this immersive journey as we explore the intricacies of leadership, entertainment, and what it means to be human. Welcome back to Dynamic Dialogues. Today we're going to be talking about show calling in different scenarios and how show calling can change and the things to consider when we're show calling in different scenarios as a stage manager. Let's lay the foundation by understanding what show calling is all about. And at its core, show calling is the process of directing and orchestrating a live event or performance, and it involves collaborating with a bunch of departments that are responsible for various different aspects of the production. That could be audio, lighting, automation, projections, front of house, security. It could be anything like that. And it is the coordination of all those pieces and departments coming together to ensure that everything runs smoothly and that we're able to do the event successfully. And usually there is a script to run a production. It could be a play, it could be a musical, it could be an opera, it could be ballet, it might be a cirque act, it might be a corporate event, it could be an immersive experience. There's a whole lot of different events out there that we are responsible for coordinating and show calling. And the script is sometimes an actual script, which could be lines and words and blocking notations. And other times it might be just a structure that we form based out of rehearsals and out of tech that is a document that tells us when things happen, what happens with what the visual cues are, what the audio cues are we waiting for speakers, are we doing presentations, how do all those things start to come together? And it's kind of bringing all of those elements together into one place so that it's centralized information that everyone can have and access. A lot of times whenever we're calling cues, it could be based on visual cues, it could be based on, like I was saying, it could be based on presenters, it could be based on a lot of different things, and also it can be based on our intuition and being connected with what's happening on stage and with the performers and sort of in response to what they're doing on stage. Translating, especially visual and intuitive cues, into writing can be one of the most difficult parts of creating a calling script, but quickly being able to transcribe what's happening on stage, either in a rehearsal or a tech rehearsal, in the moment, sometimes during a show, and being able to adapt to that, and also in taking that from rehearsals and tech rehearsals and putting that down onto paper is a really hard thing to do. But being able to do that and execute it correctly, in my opinion, is what makes a really great show caller. And it sort of becomes this kind of like sixth sense that you develop over time, where the more that you do it and the more that you flex that muscle and that you feel what that's like, the better that you can be at it. Really, and ultimately, a show caller is responsible for communicating cues, instructions, and timing to the team that you're working with. The role requires exceptional organizational skills, clear communication, and a cool head under pressure. And that's probably really summing up what show calling is in a nutshell. They can be done at normal levels of stress and high levels of stress, and that is really what makes a show caller shine, when they're able to continue the show on when things don't go right, which, let's be honest, 5 times out of 10 probably is going to happen. And being able to roll with the punches and problem solve in the moment, not getting overwhelmed and not stressed, is what can make you an average show caller to an exceptional show caller. And that takes practice. And the more that you are in those situations and the more that you are more self-aware and that you practice on communication and a lot of things that I'm going to be talking about on this podcast and also what I write about in the half-hour blog, you can start to take some of this and work on being a better leader and also ultimately being a better show caller and a stage manager. Let's discuss different types of show calling. When I think of live performance, I usually categorize them into traditional and non-traditional. At least that's how I used to think about it. But the more that I was thinking about this topic and the more that I was writing and formulating my outline, the more I think that a lot of what I considered non-traditional are actually a lot more frequent. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of theater out there, like plays and musicals and very like Broadway style performances, but there's a lot more that falls outside of traditional, like immersive theater, dance, opera, circus, corporate events. There's a lot of different types of events that are happening all over the world that are, that I would typically define as a non-traditional style. But there's a lot more of those out there. So, which I think is more interesting. I think I love working on plays, and I think plays have a lot of value to them, just like anything else. But it is a very different speed, so to speak. It's very predictable, and this is all my opinion, obviously. Like if you're a stage manager and you're listening to this, I don't mean to like devalue the work that you do as a stage manager on straight plays. I think that that's where I started, and that's where I gained a lot of my experience. And but I think the more that I've worked outside of that traditional structure, the more interesting of a stage manager I think I've become, and more flexible and more adaptable because I've worked in a lot of different scenarios. And so going back to working on like a straight play doesn't sound as appealing to me. It sounds kind of boring, and it would really depend on like what I'm working on. But anyways, getting back to the structure of traditional and non-traditional, let's talk about a few different things that go into changing the type of show call and all the little details that might affect how we approach building a call script and ultimately calling the show. And one of the main things is rehearsal time. How much rehearsal time do you have to put the show together, put the call script together, get everything aligned with all the departments? And if you're doing a traditional quote unquote play or musical, your rehearsal period is going to be much longer. It's going to be between 3 weeks and 6 weeks, maybe longer, depending on what format you're working in and what organization you're working with. But you're going to have a lot more time to develop a lot of that and to work on a lot of your paperwork and get it prepared for tech and performances. And those run times are going to be usually a lot shorter, like 3 months probably for regional, maybe 2. And if you're in some smaller theaters, it might only be for a week, a weekend, 2 weeks, something like that. There might be one-off events that you do as a play, but those are very rare, I think, unless it's a reading or something. But the budget is really going to dictate that, and the needs of the productions and the concepts and who's working and what the producers are there stars, what's the cast like, is it a big cast, a small cast? There's a lot of factors that go into the rehearsal time that is needed for an event. So that's something to think about and consider as you're approaching going into a show and putting a call script together, is rehearsal time. The next is show callers might be involved in planning for the rehearsals and the event prep, and they might be responsible for creating the schedules and coordinating with other departments, but show callers might also start later in the process. For a corporate event, for example, they might show up the day of or the day before, and they might have a rehearsal with whoever's available there, and then you might have to do the event later that day or the next day, and that might be all the rehearsal time you have, and someone might already write the script for you. You may not even have an opportunity to put a script together in the way that you want to, in the way that you like things to be formatted. So being able to adapt to those sorts of situations and being able to still do the job and do it well is a pretty great skill to have. We always like to be able to control the the scenario for ourselves and the conditions and the atmosphere. But a lot of times that's just not the case. So be prepared to go into situations where you may not have all the answers and you may not be able to make all those calls ahead of time because based on budget or based on timing or whatever the case might be, you might get in there and have to just kind of go with it. Also, the experience level of the presenters, I'm not sticking with the corporate event scenario here, the experience of corporate event presenters and the team preparing the event or the technicians that you might be working with could have a dramatic impact on how well you're able to do your job. And if your team that is giving you the script doesn't maybe have the same knowledge that you do, are not at the same level, don't have the same experience, fill in the blank, whatever that might be, you might have to work a little bit harder, like I was saying before, to get to where you need to go and to execute the job well because you're not given information that's prepared very well, or the presenters just may not know what they're doing at all on stage. And so you're having to really help and assist them to where the event can continue to go on. Also, at times, access to the building might be very limited. You might only have a specific window. Like I said before, you might be there the day before, you might be there the afternoon of, and you may not have a full rehearsal. You may not have a full technical rehearsal. You might only be able to use certain elements based on what other work is going on in the building, because there's other elements besides just the event a lot of times when you're doing corporate events and all that. So being aware that there might be other opportunities to rehearse, and something like a paper tech, sitting around a table, talking through the show, that is something that is more feasible because you can get everyone together. You don't need all the technical elements. You don't need all of the space to do that. You can find a small space in a corner somewhere, in a coffee shop, offsite somewhere, where you can talk through and you can discuss, okay, this is what's happening. I'm calling this here. This person's going to come up. Okay, we need to prep this transition next, and you can sort of talk through the whole show. Creating organized paperwork is important regardless of what the production is, what you're calling. It could be corporate, it could be theater, it could be circus, dance, it doesn't matter. Having organized and concise paperwork is important regardless, and it makes it easier for everyone if you take the time to nail out those details. Sometimes digital is easier and quicker, especially when there's updates that are coming fast and quick and you don't have time to reprint, or you don't have a printer, or whatever that case is. Sometimes doing digital is better, and things are moving more digital as time goes on. There are a lot of there's a lot of good arguments for using paper copies, and I can go into that in another episode where I'm discussing technology and things like that. But I think that there is definitely a case for using paper. But in this example, I think considering that digital might just be easier and quicker, and trying to not worry about printing and just saying, here's the link, here's the whatever you're using, Google, or if you're using ShowFlow or anything like that, whenever things are like moving rapidly. I think that paperwork is more prevalent in things that are a longer run, like a Broadway production or a tour or a Cirque du Soleil show, or something that is like a resident show, something that is going to be around for a while and can be more, you can really nail a lot of those things down and hone a lot of that information. And sometimes when you're working on something that's a lot more fast paced, you just don't have the time for it, and you just have to get the information done and out to people. So digital can be a really powerful tool for that. Some calling considerations for different project types. Sticking with the corporate event scenario for a bit longer, things like DSMs or downstage monitors, teleprompters for the presenters, those are common practice, and any changes that the script needs, they have to be communicated to the operators of those devices and to the presenters and to producers, show callers, ASMs. So that's an element that you don't typically interact with on some other events. You don't have presenters maybe, or whatever that case is. Teleprompters obviously are usually not used in a lot of events, mostly corporate events, and sometimes you have to deal with cameras, so you have to be aware of the filming needs and the time. When are you going to commercial if it's a live broadcast? You have to work with the director for the film. the filming aspect of everything. So the timing could become very important. So keeping an eye on that is really important. Some considerations to make moving out of corporate a little bit is keeping an eye on the scenery and performers that might be on automated scenery, that might be on in harnesses. There might be things moving behind them or near them. So keeping an eye on safety is always a top priority in any scenario. But getting clears and thinking of those kinds of things as you're building a calling script or as you're learning a call or you're coming up to an event that has things like that, consider all the technical elements that are coming together and the things that you need to think about and consider as you're going into that event. Also, as you're building your call script, consider how all these complex systems are communicating with each other. Are they using time code? Are they using MIDI? Another communicating system that might be communicating between interfaces and devices? And what possible technical difficulties could you get into, and how do you solve that issue if something happens mid-show and you're trying to navigate around that? And how can you solve that issue? So preemptively thinking through some of those problems that you potentially could encounter, and how do you solve that? What questions can you ask ahead of time to your technicians and to the technical director and whoever is there to help support you, that if this happens, do we have a backup for this? Or if this happens, how can we solve this? It's not our jobs to know the intricacies of everything that happens and how it works and what it's actually doing, but it's being aware of them so it can help us as show callers whenever things go south and we have to go around and maneuver within a performance, and it happens often. So here's some calling differences depending on the type of show. So going back to traditional plays and musicals, that's what I'm categorizing as traditional, like I mentioned. You're based on a predetermined script using usually a longer rehearsal period, like I was saying, 3 weeks or more. You have blocking notations that are used to track where people move on stage so that the director can revisit scenes a lot of times, because you will rehearse through the whole play and you might go back and front, back, sideways, diagonal, all the ways, and you have to be able to refer back to what you worked on. Cues are often created on words and lines, usually because they're defined markers for starts and ends to scenes. Although there are visual cues too. For example, when a character crosses the stage to pick up a phone or turn on a light switch or something like that you're calling a cue on. I tend to call cues visually because that's a lot more predictable for me, and the lines are helpful guides to have like a reference point, but I'm typically taking things off of a visual cue. It's just a lot more reliable for me. Also, show callers can take cues off of an orchestra conductor, downbeats and buttons and things like that. Especially musicals, you're taking cues off of the conductor. Show callers are often responsible too for calling all the cues in the show whenever you're working on a play or a musical, which are always outlined in the calling script. The lights are called sound cues, automation, projections, anything like that is typically always called by the stage manager. Moving on to opera, it's based on a musical score, and it's dictated entirely by the musical stuff. Everything's about music in opera. There isn't anything that's spoken in opera. It's all sang. So following the score is really important. You do take blocking notations similar to theatrical productions, plays and musicals, and tracking where they're moving, what props they're using, their costume changes, all that sort of stuff. They're usually made on a piano score, the calling scripts, and it's easy to communicate the start and stop points with the maestro or maestra, depending on rehearsals, because they're using the score to move through the opera. And so using the piano score, so you're using the same language, is really important. For operas, show callers are typically responsible for calling all cues as well. And knowing that you're working with a live orchestra as well, that's another layer of everything. So you might be cueing the maestro, you might be having cue lights for the maestro, you might have a speaker before. There's a lot more pomp and circumstance, I feel, in opera, and a lot more tradition, quote unquote, there's a lot more things to consider whenever you're doing opera, but you are typically calling all the cues. You usually don't have an audio or sound cue, obviously, because you have a live orchestra. So that's also something to be aware of. Moving on to dance, it's all based on physical movement and music, and rarely does it have a script unless it's something very specific to what the choreographer wants. But it's usually a combination of dance and music that you're usually calling off of. Blocking notations sometimes might be taken, but usually the choreographer is driving that process and has a really good grasp on where people are, and are usually the ones that are revisiting the scenes or the pieces and the choreography in the piece itself. And so you're not usually responsible for taking blocking for situations like that. I usually rely on the choreographer to be responsible for that and to really help me with going to and from certain parts and what music we need and all that sort of stuff. Calling scripts are usually created from scratch. I create mine in a Word document usually, and I use a table, and I use like a cue and a visual and what the cue number is and all that sort of stuff. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy, and that's something that I have found that's been really helpful with me for creating call scripts for dance productions. They're usually responsible for calling cues in the show, just like opera or plays or musicals. We're calling lighting and music and possibly automation or projections. It depends on the scale of the actual productions. Sometimes I've seen in dance the lighting designer actually taking their own cues if it's like a smaller production, or if it's a limited run or something like that. Sometimes the lighting designer will take that themselves, and so that's part of the culture in dance sometimes. For corporate and live event, I feel like I've talked a lot about this already, but just to recap, that it's based on and driven by the goals of the client who's hosting the event, which is called the end client. And typically it's one-time event, and you're only going to do it one time. You might do it twice. There might be several scripts that need to be compiled into one, and it might have a lot of different people who are contributing and have different stakes that you're trying to align and bring together into one goal. You're usually not going to have a traditional script. You're not going to have something that exists beforehand unless someone has typed it up for you. And so creating something in an Excel document like a spreadsheet, I mentioned ShowFlow earlier. That's a company that developed a program that is basically what element it is and what technical elements need to happen and in what time and all that sort of stuff. Corporate events move very quickly and have very limited time on site. I mentioned earlier that you might not have a lot of rehearsal time, and you might have to do a lot of the prep work before you actually get there. Show callers are responsible for calling all the cues in the show, and the events move very, very quickly and can change on a dime. So being very focused and very clear on what you're working on is crucial. Moving on to circus. Circus shows are usually created and established to maintain a long-running show, either in residence or on tour. And a lot of circus companies work differently, but most of them are either resident or touring shows. And similar to dance, circus is often not based on a scripted material, and a lot of circus shows don't typically have a script. Some are designed that way. They might have an MC or some sort of like front man that might have some scripted things, but most of the time it's very heavily dependent on music. They have live instruments, live performers, all that kind of stuff that is really driving the show. And listening to music and watching visual cues are often what we're using as show callers. Performers are usually automated on flying systems in the air. They could be on set pieces that are moving. They could be in water. They could be on a stage. There's a whole vast array of instances of how circus is creating certain things and pushing the limits on how performers are existing on stage. It's pretty cool to see how circus is pushing those limits and telling stories in really unique ways. And there could also be effects like water effects, pyrotechnics, haze and fog. Like I said before, there could be pools, waters, lifts. There's a whole bunch of different things. And safety and emergency response is really big part of everything, but especially in circus, I feel like there's a lot of dangerous things that we deal with. So safety is always the top priority for us while we're working in circus. Lastly, I'm going to discuss immersive theater. It might be based on a script. It might not be based on a script. It could be based on a television show, a social phenomenon. It could be based on other types of things that have been brought into one idea. And so there might be scripts that you're following, but there might also be some visual things. There might be musical things. You might be paying attention to what the audience is doing before you move on to the next piece. And immersive events are designed to be repeated over and over and over and over and over. And because of this fact, there are usually not show callers, because that would be really hard and really taxing, I think, on one show caller. So it's usually either automated or it's split into a lot of different roles so that there's more people who are executing that, to where it's not based on one person. Because the more times you do it, the more likely you are to have an error, and it might cause a show stop, which then costs money. And then so trying to mitigate that, there's usually a lot more people who are involved in executing the event so that there's less error and there's more eyes and opportunity to catch things that might go wrong. So the last thing I want to discuss as a show caller is your communication. There's a few different ways that we primarily communicate while we're show calling. And that obviously is channel A, which is sometimes called show call, and it's the main channel that we use on our headsets to communicate during a show about cues, where things need to be, standing by, if we're holding, if there's an emergency, when something happens. So channel A is the primary way that we're talking with the team about the show, what's happening, and where we're going. Channel B, sometimes called a private channel, is a channel that's dedicated for a specific group or a department. For example, the stage management team might have a private channel. The lighting team might have a private channel. The automation team might have a private channel. Front of house might have a private channel. So depending on the size and scope of the production, you might all share one channel, which is channel A, or you might have a channel A and a channel B between everyone. And you might have multiple different channel Bs to where teams can communicate within themselves and then communicate to channel A once more information is available. So there's a lot I've seen it happen in a lot of different ways. Depending on the size of the production, you might have a radio, which can be a really great tool when you need to keep channel A and channel B clear. If there's a lot of things happening or you're discussing something that is not super important, but it needs to get done, you can radio people and you can talk about things that need to happen that way as well. Another great communication tool is chat, using our phones, using our computers, technology, and being able to communicate with people via chat, phone call, things like that can be really expedient and can get answers really quickly, and you don't have to interrupt what's happening in the show, and you don't have to interrupt anything that's happening or to impede anything that's happening. And you can create like a more private channel. You can create, as everyone knows, a myriad of group chats. We all love group chats, don't we? Yes, we love a good group chat. And finally, face-to-face communication is always acceptable to use, and sometimes the best way to communicate things. If you're able to communicate face-to-face rather than sending an email or a text, by all means, please communicate face-to-face, and that can be the best way sometimes. Show calling is an art, and it brings live events to life. And I don't think it's undervalued, but I think that not enough people give it the credit it deserves. And until you're in the hot seat and you really understand what it requires to call a show, to deal with an emergency, to deal with a show stop, you don't quite understand what the job is. You see it from the outside. Whether it's a theatrical performance, a play, or a musical, it could be a live concert, sports event, circus, corporate event, anything that we've discussed, show callers play a pivotal role to ensure that everything is happening on time and moving forward and accomplishing that goal of a successful performance. And really, it is the backbone of any live event. And being able to seamlessly coordinate and execute an event is invaluable, in my opinion, because I have seen some bad show callers. I have seen some events that did not come together very well. And that is, in my opinion, a result of bad communication and bad leadership and someone who doesn't know what they're doing. And sometimes we have to go through those things to learn 100%. But taking a look and preparing and knowing what it takes to put up these kinds of events and going into those arenas with that knowledge is going to be so helpful, and it's going to be able to drive your process and make you a more effective show caller. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider checking out the Half Hour blog at itshalfhour.blog, where we have multiple articles around leadership topics, communication tips, and much more. So check it out at itshalfhour.blog. If you'd like to learn more and listen more to this podcast, you can check it out at dynamicdialoguespodcast.com. We have new episodes every Monday. Click the subscribe button and you'll be notified when they're released. Brian off headset.